Heidi Burgess. Today I'm going to start talking about small-scale, bottom-up reconciliation processes. In this video, we're going to talk about de-escalating destructive us versus them confrontations. The former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, was famous for his line, "All politics is local." By that he meant a politician's success depends on the degree to which he can keep his local constituents happy. They are much more concerned about local, sometimes mundane issues, he said, than they are about national or global big picture issues. So the key to a congressperson's success, in O'Neill's view, is their ability to help their constituents deal with their day-to-day challenges. In a sense, all reconciliation is local too. In 1993, Yasser Arafat and Itzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords, putting into place a peace process that was to result in the creation of two independent states, Israel and Palestine. Of course, that didn't happen, in part because the people on the ground at the grassroots level did not accept the agreement or the deals made within it. Although the peace process stumbled along for 7 years before it finally died with the onset of the Second Intifada, lack of enthusiasm among people on both sides sealed its fate. So while top level, what is called track one among peace builders, negotiations are essential for formal cessation of hostilities, and top level involvement in reconciliation processes such as truth commissions is very important. I would argue that widespread local participation in reconciliation activities is at least as important, if not more important, than top level involvement. The local arena is also where most of us have agency. Many conflict resolution students I've taught have gone through a period of depression, not clinical depression in most cases, but just discouragement because the conflicts they are studying all seem so hopeless. That's particularly true in my courses because I teach about intractable conflicts, which, while I earnestly point out are not hopeless, they are very difficult to transform or resolve. So when I drone on and on about all the terrible things that have gone on and are going on, it can get quite overwhelming. One of my current students, Marin Hollinsworth, posted on our open discussion board, and I'm quoting her now, "I get overwhelmed and sad, and I don't really know what to do with that besides cry." My first response was, that's common. Many people feel that way. But before I responded, she continued on to say that she was pulled out of her depression by John Paul Lederach's book, The Moral Imagination. In it, Lederach follows 4 people who individually made huge differences in their bringing peace to their communities. They were not leaders, they were not trained conflict resolution specialists. They were simply people who had the moral imagination to bring about change. Lederach's moral imagination has 4 components. They are the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships, even with our enemies. The ability to embrace complexity without getting caught up in a social schism. The commitment to the creative act, and an acceptance of risk. Let's talk about each of those in turn. First, Lederach asks us to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships, even, he says, with our enemy. This is the same thing that Ibrahim Rasool told us at PeaceCon 2020, where he said that one key step towards South African reconciliation was determining that both blacks and whites were there to stay and South Africa belonged to all who lived there. Peace builders must understand that we are all in this web of relationships. Some people are closer to us than others, but we are connected to everyone, sometimes with surprisingly few degrees of separation. We are in a relationship with our estranged relatives, even when we don't want to be. Family is there forever, whether we like them or not. We're in relationships with our neighbors, our co-workers, Our classmates, both the ones we like and the ones we don't like so much, or not at all. We are all caught up in this thing called life and school and community together. Second, Letterock says, embrace complexity. In 2018, I created a video for Beyond Intractability entitled See the Complexity, It's Not Just Us Versus Them. When we're in a heated conflict, most of us simplify it down to a very comfortable story. We're good, they're bad. The solution is either to get rid of them, punish them, or force them to see it our way. For minor conflicts, that sometimes works, although it often costs us the relationship that might have been a good one had we dealt with it differently. But in big conflicts, these big societal level intractable conflicts that I study, simplifying it down to us versus them is hardly ever correct, and it certainly destroys any hope we have for coming to resolution or reconciliation. Rather, I completely agree with John Paul. We need to embrace the complexity of the conflicts we are in, and we need to understand that the evil other probably isn't as evil as we think they are. Maybe they have a good reason to do what they did. Or maybe they were just ignorant, and if more informed, they do something different next time. So try to figure out what's really going on and don't just explain it away with us versus them assumptions. Letterock's third requirement for moral imagination is creativity. If a conflict needs to be reconciled, it's because the disputing parties are at odds, and they maybe have been for quite some time. The conflict narratives can be deeply entrenched, as we're learning now in the United States. Their worldviews, their facts, what they believe to be true, their values, what they believe to be good, can be totally different. If people or groups are going to be able to reconcile, they're going to have to create something new, a new version of the past, the present, and the future, one that has people in better relationships than they currently are in. Creating this new vision takes creativity. It requires a belief that people can change, people can learn, people can change hate into love. That takes creativity. And finally, Letterock says the moral imagination requires an acceptance of risk. Whatever we do, we might fail. We have to be willing to accept that. But if we are skilled, if we have the knowledge and creativity we need, we also might succeed. And if we don't try, we certainly can't succeed. My student, Marin, explained that Letterock helped her see that she could change things in her own life that could make a big difference to a lot of people. In her words, I can create artful change in the simplest tasks as a daughter, mother, and friend to work towards the imagined future that I desire. I think there's a lot to be said about the changes we can make in our own home and how much our simple peace practicing can influence the world in ways we will not even know. Being mindful of our moral imagination can give us the strength to be artful in our peace-building opportunities, to better the world and our families and throughout. I guess what I'm simply trying to say is that what I do matters, and that is powerful enough to make me want to keep trying to creatively cultivate peace. Guy and I are putting together a new massive open online seminar, or MOOC, of which this will be a part, that argues that local, bottom-up, small-scale peace building needs to accomplish at least 5 things. These are de-escalate destructive us versus them confrontations, promote effective intergroup communication, develop a unifying vision and a path to get there, level the playing field if wealth, income, power is unequal, and take advantage of opportunities for mutually beneficial joint actions. The first step is to de-escalate destructive us versus them confrontations. There are many ways to do this, but among the most important are recognizing that the other isn't the only problem, depolarizing society away from us versus them confrontations toward collaboration on addressing the real problem, escalation and other destructive conflict dynamics. So a first step is recognizing that the situation is probably more complicated than you think it is. For a start, it probably isn't entirely their fault. It's likely you even had some part of making the situation as bad as it is. So a good way to start is examining your own contribution to the situation. Though the other side may be more wrong than you are, most often everybody has contributed to the situation in some way. For instance, by overreacting to a small problem, assuming worse intentions than were appropriate, saying things that shouldn't have been said. If we acknowledge our own errors and apologize for them, that can help start a de-escalatory process. I am not suggesting, however, that we take responsibility for or apologize for things that were not our own doing or things that we still feel are appropriate and justified. I talk about this more in an earlier BI video entitled Business as Usual Part 3, The Blame Game. Another way to start de-escalation is to make a conciliatory gesture, which is also called a de-escalating or disarming gesture. This is when you do something that is nicer than what the other side expected you to do. Acknowledging one's contribution to a situation is actually a conciliatory gesture. So too is acknowledging the pain that the other side is feeling, indicating a willingness to hear their side of the story, reaching out in some way, human to human. One of the best high-profile examples of such a gesture was Anwar Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1977. Sadat was president of Egypt at the time, and in 1977 he offered to visit Israel, the first Arab leader ever to do so. He met with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and he spoke at the Knesset about his thoughts on how to achieve Israeli peace. Israelis were very positively moved by Sadat's gesture of openness, and this trip paved the way to the negotiation of the Camp David Accords a year later, a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt which still holds to this day. Another example of a conciliatory gesture was the African National Congress's assertion that South Africa belongs to everyone who lives there, black and white. As I explained in the earlier Ingredients of Reconciliation video, Ibrahim Rasool, the former U.S. ambassador to South Africa, explained the statement that South Africa belonged to everyone who lived there was not only a statement of vision, it was an extension of friendship. It was an act of generosity. Even as whites continued to disempower and often kill blacks in South Africa, the blacks had, in Rasool's words, the supreme humanity to say that South Africa even belonged to everyone. That disrupted the little pictures, Rasool called them, that whites had constructed in their minds and allowed them to open themselves up to new ideas. That's the key to the effectiveness of conciliatory gestures. It changes the enemy images people have in their minds about the other. Israelis learned that Sadat was a friendly, intelligent, thoughtful, caring, likable person, not the devil they had imagined him to be. White South Africans were taken aback by the ANC's generosity, and they began to see blacks as more human than they had envisioned them previously. So these two tools can help you reframe escalation to be the enemy more than the other is the enemy. This enables you to collaborate with the other to beat the real enemy, conflict escalation and other destructive conflict dynamics, such as enemy imaging, hate mongering, spreading fake facts about the other, and so on. that together you can work to de-escalate the conflict, making it more ripe for reconciliation. Another important way to de-escalate a conflict, making it more ripe for mediation or negotiation or reconciliation, is to diminish the use of coercive power as much as possible. Paul Ware, a peace scholar at the University of Colorado, adopted Kenneth Boulding's notion of the three faces of power, a title of one of Boulding's many seminal conflict resolution books, to develop what Paul called the power strategy mix. This notion is that Boulding's three power strategies, coercion, exchange, in other words, negotiation, and integrative power, should not be used alone, but in various combinations depending on who the actor is trying to influence. Guy added to this the notion that there are four basic types of people that you might want to influence. He called these persuadables, reluctant persuadables, traitors, and incorrigibles. Persuadables are just like they sound. They're people who are willing to listen to others who disagree with them and are open to being persuaded to change their opinion if given good explanation of why they might do so. People like this should be approached gently and respectfully, with little, if any, coercion. You might offer them something in exchange for their support, but mostly you rely on effective persuasion to get them what you want them to do. The next group of people are those who are not so easily persuaded, but they're still willing to listen, and they'll consider your arguments. You might need a little more incentive to get them to change than you need of the first group, but to the extent possible, this should be carrots, in other words, exchange power rather than sticks or coercion, because coercion tends to anger people and lead them to backlash. So as much as possible, the incentive should be a reward for doing what you want them to do, not a punishment if they do not. The third group of people, the traitors, are those who aren't particularly hung up on principle or even interested in it. They have their interests, and if you can meet them, they'll be willing to meet yours. For folks like this, interest-based negotiation is clearly the primary strategy one should use, combined perhaps with some integrative power, showing how they'll benefit from working together with you for the good of everyone. And again, only if necessary, a little bit of coercion to get their attention and get them moving. The fourth group, farthest to the right, is what Guy calls the incorrigibles. These are people who are totally set in their beliefs and their demands. They're not going to listen to arguments. They're not going to respond to offers to trade. They know they're right, they know you're wrong, and they're going to do everything that they can to force you to behave and think in the way they want you to behave and think. For people like this, the only way to get them to change is to use coercion, stronger coercion than they're using on you. But this is a dangerous game, so it should only be done as a last resort. And one should try to add in a little bit of integrative power and exchange power if there's any opportunity to do so, in order to give your use of coercion as much legitimacy as possible. Laws, for instance, are legitimate forms of coercion, at least for people who believe in the rule of law. Now note that the right column is much narrower than the other three columns. That's because Guy and I assert that most people are actually not incorrigibles. They may present that way because that's all they've been taught, but if gently helped along, most people will usually turn out to be one of the three types to the left, all of whom can be worked with successfully if you use what Paul Ware called the optimal power strategy mix. So the key here is to consider who you're trying to influence, and don't use any more coercion than is absolutely necessary. Rather, rely as much as possible on persuasion and integrative power, attempts to help people see that we're all in this together, along with interest-based negotiation to get them to do what you want them to do. I'm going to end this video here and cover the other four strategies of bottom-up small-scale peace building in another 4 videos to come. Thanks.